Harold woke up earlier than usual, which puzzled his wife, and immediately stepped outside. He paused to take in his surroundings. It was quiet, and it seemed like nothing was threatening their small world. The sea, not far from their home, was restless, and its waves somehow reminded him that life, though calm, was not as carefree as it once had been. Looking at the sea evoked mixed feelings in him. On one hand, he loved this place, but on the other, he understood that it was no longer safe here. 5 years ago, he and his wife had moved here to live a secluded life. They kept a few livestock, but Harold spent most of his time fishing. It was enough to feed them, and they sold the surplus in a nearby village. With that money, they bought everything they needed for daily life. They lived happily and peacefully without children, fully devoted to each other and their small homestead. But recently, something had changed. The number of monsters in the area had significantly increased. They used to be rare, and Harold would avoid them by simply running away. But now there were so many that he could no longer roam these lands freely. Fishing was also becoming more dangerous as the sea teemed with creatures. Harold understood that if things continued like this, they would either starve or be killed by these creatures. Recently, some beast broke in at night and ate a couple of their pigs. Their stockpile of grain and dried meat wouldn't last long. Weighing all his options, Harold decided to try his luck and go fishing. Luckily, the sea was calm, and he managed to catch a few fish. On his way home, following the road that led to the village, he suddenly encountered a monster. The creature looked like a mix between a wolf and a boar, hideous, with a mass of sharp teeth and enormous paws. It leaped in front of him, growling. The old man felt his heart drop into his stomach. He thought his end had come. He held a string of fish in one hand and a fishing rod in the other. The thought flashed through his mind to throw the fish to distract the beast. But the creature didn't care. It looked at him with hungry eyes, anticipating an easy meal. Harold wanted to run, but his legs felt like jelly, and a sense of complete helplessness spread through his chest. He had never been brave or daring, and when faced with such danger, he completely lost his nerve. As the creature bent its legs preparing to pounce, something incredible happened. The monster exploded, scattering into pieces and splattering Harold with blood and flesh. The old man stood in shock, not understanding what had happened. Slowly turning his head, he saw a knight in black armor standing on the road. The knight was tall, almost a giant, with a huge black sword, and his face was hidden under a helmet. Beside him stood a young man with a bowl haircut, wearing glasses and a robe, holding a book. It was likely he who had just cast the spell that destroyed the monster. A girl in armor ran up to them and asked Harold if he was okay. The old man nodded uncertainly and mumbled that he seemed to be fine. The girl's smile reassured him. Suddenly, he heard a noise and saw that people were coming down the road from the trees. There were many of them, a great many. They passed by him, talking to each other, some riding carts, others walking, children running around, some leading livestock or dragging bags. They were peasants, and Harold recognized among them Jack, the miller from the neighboring village. Jack, seeing Harold, waved to him and approached. "Are you all right?" Jack asked, noticing the explosion's aftermath on the old man. Harold nodded, but then asked what was going on. "We're leaving these lands," Jack said sadly. "The monsters are becoming more and more numerous. If this continues, they'll devour us all. We've decided to join this group and move to the city. I suggest you do the same. Staying here alone is too dangerous." Jack's words left Harold no time to think. He ran home, shouting to his wife to gather everything valuable. His wife, seeing the alarm on his face, became frightened, but trusted her husband. They quickly packed everything they needed, loaded it onto a small cart that Harold took and pulled. His wife took the only remaining chicken and walked beside him. When they got onto the road, the stream of people was still moving. Joining the group, the old man glanced ahead and noticed that the black-armored knight was watching him. He felt a slight sense of security in his heart. Richard watched the old man and his wife, who had joined their column. Although he had complained at first, he gradually got used to the idea that his role now was not only to protect his small group, but also to ensure the safety of the entire crowd of people. It all started after they left the castle where they had rescued Agna. They were heading toward the city of Amelia to visit the main temple of the moon goddess. Balthazar had gathered them and drawn a map, indicating that they should follow the coast, cross several villages, and then reach a river where they would find a ferry to cross to the other side. From there, it was not far to their destination. Agreeing on the route, they set off. However, strange things began to happen along the way. The first problem was a vampire who had kidnapped Agna and was now stalking them. Richard and the others were puzzled, trying to figure out what he wanted from them. The vampire didn't seem hostile. Rather, he just watched them, doing so clumsily enough that they always noticed his presence. It felt as if he was too shy to speak to them. This stalking was unsettling, but soon they got used to it and stopped paying attention, especially after Balthazar assured them that everything was fine. Besides, although he had previously kidnapped people, he had not harmed any of them. The second problem was that the number of monsters along the way had sharply increased. Where they came from was unclear, but they constantly attacked the group, forcing them to delay and deviate from their route. On the positive side, Jenner proved his worth by literally incinerating the monsters with his spells. Gradually, he became part of the group, opening up to them and telling them about his past, his studies in magic, and his childhood. Richard liked him, as did the others. At first, he thought Jenner would be an arrogant snob, but he turned out to be more human and pleasant to talk to. However, he had one passion. He loved studying magic. Along the way, he constantly asked the monk about the secrets of moon magic and also studied Richard and his curse magic. As they walked down the road, they came across a village that was under attack by monsters. Richard noticed that villages lacking protection were the most vulnerable, especially now, when the number of creatures had increased. The locals had only a few militia members, and they couldn't handle the attacking monsters. When the group arrived, they quickly dealt with the beasts, and the villagers thanked them. However, when the group prepared to leave, the villagers didn't want to let them go. In the end, they decided to join them, leaving no one behind in the village. There were about 100 of them, dragging carts loaded with supplies and everything they had accumulated over their lives. Richard frowned watching this. He didn't like being delayed, but the rest of the group didn't mind. They felt sorry for leaving these people in danger. One day, Agna noticed that the vampire who had been constantly following them had disappeared. It seemed harmless enough, but they had already gotten used to him. In the vampire's place, a suspicious man joined them, supposedly a villager whom no one knew. He was about 25 years old with green eyes and curly black hair. He was handsome with a particularly striking large straight nose. Along the way, he constantly tried to blend in with their group, eavesdropping on conversations, trying to talk to them, and offering them various treats. His name was Lance. For an ordinary peasant, he was too smart and had a broad worldview. Richard immediately realized that Lance wasn't who he claimed to be, and suspected that he was the vampire count. But he had no proof, and Lance behaved friendly, entertaining everyone with interesting stories. Gradually, he became part of the group. On the road, Richard patrolled along the column, fending off side attacks. Jenner led the way, burning the monsters that crossed their path. Agna guarded the other flank, while Balthazar brought up the rear. Enzio, the pet, ran around, warning of danger with his sharp nose. Thanks to him, they avoided ambushes and casualties. Enzio had noticeably grown, now reaching Richard's chest and able to carry children and even Agna. The children adored him, holding on to his small horns, which looked like bull horns. He was friendly to everyone, especially to Richard, to whom he was particularly attached. However, he didn't like the young mage, and everyone wondered why. Jenner was upset, sniffing himself and speculating that maybe he smelled bad or his magic repelled Enzio. But no one knew the answer. Balthazar, on the other hand, had been gloomy and thoughtful lately. From time to time he would glance at the sky, which had become almost constantly overcast. The red tint that had appeared in the sky after the city disappeared had passed, but the sky still seemed dark and gloomy. The monk surprised the peasants, who wondered what a blind man could see in the sky. They continued on, crossing wastelands and entering new villages. The problem was that every village they visited, the inhabitants abandoned and joined the column. One day they came across a village completely surrounded by creatures, and the inhabitants were waiting for their end. The group quickly dealt with them, and the column grew even larger. It became harder for Richard to protect everyone, but Enzio did his job well, and fortunately, there were no casualties. This time, Richard walked at the front of the column, carefully scanning the area. To his right, the forest that had accompanied them for the past few days was gradually coming to an end, and to his left stretched the sea. The road followed the coastline, weaving gently in and out, tracing the contours of the shore. Before long, they came across a small stream and decided to take a break, first checking the area for any monsters. The rest stop turned out to be noisy and lively. People, from the elderly to children, chatted loudly, pulling out their supplies and lighting fires to cook food. Agna, standing near the stream, peered into the water and noticed many fish swimming in the clear water. She turned to the others with a dreamy smile and said, "I'd love to have some fresh fish right now." Jenner, catching her mood, grinned mischievously. With a short incantation, he raised his hand, and suddenly the air above the stream filled with dozens of fish, which slowly levitated to the shore and fell onto the grass. Everyone who saw it froze in amazement, followed by applause and admiring shouts. The mage was praised and thanked, and he, blushing from embarrassment, only nodded in response. Agna picked up several fish and began cleaning them, while Lance brought a pot to prepare soup. Balthazar, sitting nearby, seemed lost in thought. Richard grew tired of the monk's constant grim expression and addressed him. "Old man, are you ever going to tell us what's on your mind? You've been wearing that sour face the whole way?" Balthazar lifted his head and gave a weak smile. "Forgive me," he began. "I've been thinking a lot lately." "Well, then tell us what about," Jenner chimed in, scooting closer. The old man removed his hat, rubbed his forehead, and put it back on, starting to speak. Agna and Lance perked up their ears while preparing lunch. "Once, 1,000 years ago," the monk began, "the gods appeared to the emperor and commanded him to build fortress cities. At the time, there were no monsters, no threats, and many doubted the need for such a task. People lived peacefully, enjoying prosperity and calm, and the idea of building massive walls and fortifications seemed absurd to them. But the emperor was a wise ruler. He did not dare to disobey the gods and began large-scale construction. These fortresses were incredibly large and powerful, designed to withstand any siege. Inside there was everything necessary for autonomous existence: homes, storage, gardens, and even water reservoirs. These cities were self-sufficient and could house thousands of people for years. When the construction was complete, many still didn't understand the purpose. It seemed like a colossal waste of resources. But then the invasion began. From beyond the horizon, seemingly out of nowhere, came the monsters. They flooded the land, ravaging villages and destroying everyone in their path. People were utterly unprepared for such a catastrophe. The emperor, realizing the gravity of the situation, issued a decree that would go down in history as the last day's call. He ordered all his subjects to take refuge in the fortress cities. Every mage, knight, and anyone with power was to help the people reach safety behind those walls. This decree saved countless lives. The people who took shelter in those fortresses were able to survive when the world outside turned into a living hell. But that was just the beginning. After the monster invasion intensified, another cataclysm came: the eternal night. It threatened to wipe out all living things, as plants cannot survive without light. So the mages created an artificial sun, which lit the gardens and fields, giving people a chance to continue fighting. Balthazar sighed and lowered his head before continuing. Now I see similar signs. They're building up slowly. I knew the invasion was close, but not this close. I thought we had more time. But the ritual that caused the entire city to disappear seems to have accelerated the process. That's why I think we need to hurry. The king may have to issue another last day's call. Everyone fell silent, absorbing what they had just heard. Richard grew deeply thoughtful, his mind wandering back to his hometown. He recalled its tall stone walls that rose, protecting the city from any invasion. These walls curved around the city, and on the other side it was defended by a majestic cliff towering over an ancient forest. It was from this very cliff that he had once been thrown, and he furrowed his brow, trying to push away the unpleasant memories. But thoughts of his family still crept into his mind, and he wondered how the old man who worked at the forge was doing, hoping that he was all right. Meanwhile, his companions were also troubled by the looming threat Balthazar had spoken of. It was serious. The old man had finished his grim story, and soon everyone gathered for the meal Agna had prepared. Richard watched her with mild surprise. The girl, who had once never lifted anything heavier than a spoon, now gutted fish with remarkable skill, pulling out the entrails and scraping off the scales. Over time, she had learned to cook and do laundry, and she never once complained about the hardships. Beside her stood Lance, offering tips on how to improve the dish, and Agna listened attentively, tasting the stew until she achieved the perfect result. Richard, though still suspicious of Lance, had to admit that the fish was excellently prepared, and he ate with great appetite, occasionally casting a distrustful glance at him. When the rest stop was over, the caravan moved on once more. They walked along the coast, feeling the fresh sea breeze on their faces, and soon in the distance, they saw a towering structure on a distant cliff. A lighthouse. Majestic and foreboding, it loomed over the sea like an ancient sentinel standing watch for centuries. The lighthouse was built from rough gray stone, its walls covered in moss and mildew, as if it had become part of the cliff it stood upon. It looked ancient, as if it had been there long before anyone started recording the history of this world. The narrow arrow slits of the lighthouse, now blocked by rotting shutters, had once perhaps been used by watchmen, scanning the horizon for approaching ships. The top of the lighthouse, shrouded in thick fog, was crowned with a massive iron platform where a fire once burned, guiding sailors to shore. But now that fire had long since gone out, and only the remnants of the metal mechanism, resembling rusty claws, reached toward the sky, a silent reminder of the days when the lighthouse still served its purpose. Richard and his companions stopped at the foot of the cliff, where they could see the vast sea and the waves stretching endlessly into the distance. The path to the lighthouse appeared abandoned and long forgotten, and the tower itself filled them with a sense of unease, as if it harbored ancient secrets better left undiscovered. They stood, captivated by the view, when Lance suddenly furrowed his brow and turned his head, looking out toward the sea. His tense expression didn't escape Richard's notice, who also glanced into the distance and quickly realized something was wrong. A dense fog was rising over the sea, obscuring the horizon. It was rapidly advancing toward the shore, and soon it became clear that this fog was unnatural, as if something ominous was lurking within its shroud. The ground beneath their feet began to tremble slightly, and a strange, deep rumbling sound echoed from the direction of the water. In the distance, from the depths of the sea, a massive shark's mouth suddenly breached the surface. It leaped out, revealing its monstrous jaws as if it had swallowed something enormous. The shark was so gigantic that even a castle would seem dwarfed by comparison. A wave surged around it, disturbed by its sudden emergence, and this wave rushed toward the shore, creating a powerful tide. The travelers, stunned by the sight, froze, gripped by a mix of horror and bewilderment. One thought spun in Richard's mind. What could this creature have swallowed? He hoped it wasn't a ship. But that was only the beginning. Soon they noticed something even larger approaching the shore underwater. They saw that a school of enormous fish was moving toward the shore at incredible speed, clearly fleeing from something. As they reached the shore, the fish suddenly leaped onto the sand, thrashing wildly in convulsions. The fish were unusually large, with massive bodies that glistened under the dim light. Their silver scales, shining with every movement, sparkled as if dusted with pearls. But one fish in particular was especially strange. Its side was covered in something resembling thick red webbing, like a repulsive slime that slowly but relentlessly spread across its body. The fish flailed, trying to shake off the foul substance, but it seeped into its mouth. And in the next moment, something horrifying occurred. The fish began to change, its body deforming and elongating, its fins bending and transforming into limbs that resembled legs, its eyes glowing with a blood-red light. The mutated creature no longer looked like a fish. It was a grotesque hybrid, a nightmarish product of some ancient curse. Balthazar, seeing this, cried out in terror, "Burn it, Jenner, now!" Without hesitation, Jenner directed a powerful stream of fire at the fish, incinerating it in an instant. The creature's remains collapsed to the ground, turning into smoldering embers. The old man exhaled in relief, but his face remained tense. "It seems we got lucky," he began. But he didn't have time to finish before a massive crab suddenly leapt out of the sea with a splash. This monster was covered in the same red slime as the fish, as if infected by some unknown disease. Its claws were enormous, far larger than those of a normal crab, and its eyes, glowing with a sinister light, revealed that it was something far more than just an animal. Without wasting any time, the crab jumped onto the cliff and began quickly climbing upward, heading straight for the lighthouse. When it reached the top, where the lighthouse stood proudly, it spewed a whole mass of that same red slime toward it. The slime quickly began to cover the ancient stones, spreading across the surface. The crab then crawled to the base of the lighthouse and disappeared inside, out of sight. Suddenly, the lighthouse began to shake, as if an earthquake was occurring, and then, with a terrifying creak, it started to rise from its foundation. Richard and his companions watched in shock and disbelief. From beneath the lighthouse, massive legs suddenly emerged, lifting it like a spider standing on its hind legs. Two enormous holes burst open in the sides of the ancient structure, and from them came monstrous claws, ready to crush everything in their path. The lighthouse's light, which had previously seemed harmless, now blazed with a terrifying red glow, pulsing like a searchlight, scanning for its prey. The lighthouse transformed into something horrific. A living embodiment of ancient evil began to slowly move down from the cliff, and each of its steps shook the ground, causing it to tremble. Suddenly, the red light from the lighthouse fell on the villagers, causing them to freeze in terror. The creature seemed to become even more animated, its terrible fire blazing even brighter, and it rumbled as it moved toward them. Balthazar quickly turned to the people and, with desperation in his voice, shouted, "Run!" He immediately began casting a magical barrier, trying to hold off the monstrous structure for as long as possible. Jenner, not wasting any time, started hurling spell after spell, but his fireballs and lightning bolts shattered against the stone walls of the lighthouse, failing to cause any serious damage. Richard surveyed the enemy. The enormous lighthouse creature was moving menacingly on its massive legs, its claws swinging, threatening to destroy everything in its path. Realizing that they had little time, he decided that the only way to stop this creature was to destroy its legs. His sword, infused with moonlight, glowed brightly as if drawing strength from the night itself. Richard swung wide and sent a powerful beam of light directly at the creature's legs. However, the beam only scratched its stone limbs, not causing significant harm. Gritting his teeth in frustration, he wasted no time and charged forward, determined to bring down the foe in close combat. Agna, seeing his resolve, hesitated for a moment, gripped by fear and doubt, but then, tightening her grip on her sword, she shouted and rushed after him. Richard, skillfully maneuvering between the massive legs, tried to chop at them, aiming for the joints. His strikes were precise and strong, and he felt his sword biting into the stone flesh, cutting through it with great difficulty. The blade screeched, leaving deep grooves in the legs, but for a moment he felt it might all be in vain. The creature was too powerful. Agna, trying to assist, darted around, attempting to distract the monster. Her blows didn't deal serious damage, and she lacked the strength to break through the creature's defenses. At one point, one of the monster's massive claws came crashing down on her with incredible speed, and only by a miracle did Lance, appearing out of nowhere, manage to grab her arm and yank her out of the way. The claw slammed into the ground, leaving a huge dent where Agna had just been. Meanwhile, the barrier Balthazar had created began to crack under the force of the claws. The creature was breaking through with its massive limbs, and at some point, it started spewing fire from its top, like a hellish spotlight. A bright red beam blasted the barrier, and it began to melt under the unbearable heat. Despite the threat, Richard continued to fight. He focused on one of the creature's legs and, driven by fury, hacked at it with relentless force until he heard the stone crack. With each attack, his blows became more precise and destructive. Finally, one of the legs gave way and snapped, causing the creature to nearly topple over, losing its balance. Richard saw this as an opportunity and, without wasting time, attacked the other legs, cutting and breaking them one by one. Soon, despite the creature's desperate attempts to stay upright, it collapsed to the ground with a thunderous crash, crushing its own claws under its weight. Jenner, seeing that the creature was no longer able to move, cast a spell and directed all his power at the base of the lighthouse. A powerful stream of fire burst from his hands, enveloping the creature and consuming it from within. The flames roared with unimaginable fury, engulfing the entire structure of the lighthouse, and soon it turned into a giant bonfire. The stones, heated to the extreme, began to crack and crumble, falling to the ground. Finally, the creature, drained of its strength, collapsed, and the fire consumed it entirely, reducing it to ruins. When it was all over, Richard looked around at his companions. Agna was sitting on the grass, trying to catch her breath, while Lance stood beside her, his face as calm and composed as if nothing had happened. Jenner was nearby, his face pale and shocked after everything that had transpired. Balthazar, as usual, seemed lost in thought, as if his mind were far away from the present situation. Richard couldn't hold back and addressed the monk. "What was that red stuff?" he asked, recalling the horrific slime that had infected everything it touched. Balthazar, removing his old hat, scratched his bald head and replied, "That was the Scarlet Blight. It's a plague that was one of the main threats in the past. It can mutate any creature and even inanimate objects, as you've seen for yourself. It's an extremely dangerous substance that once terrorized entire continents. I've never encountered it before, but I recognized it immediately from descriptions in ancient texts. This is bad news for us. Very bad news. We need to hurry and continue our journey." After the conversation, the monk approached the refugees, checking to see if they were all right. Enzio, as always, was on guard, keeping watch over the situation, and thanks to his vigilance, they had avoided serious casualties. Richard took one last look at the ruins of the lighthouse, still smoldering with smoke. Casting a final glance at the site, he resolved that he needed to become stronger to deal with such threats in the future. They continued along the road that ran by the shore. The wind carried the scent of salt and freshness, but now these aromas were mingled with the smell of burning and something else, something menacing. The road wound around the curves of the coastline, and soon they saw a village in the distance. On the horizon, houses with thatched roofs began to take shape, along with old fishing boats and rows of nets drying on the shore. But something was off. Enzio suddenly tensed, his fur bristling as he began to growl in warning. Richard noticed his behavior and realized that the dog had sensed something unnatural. Balthazar immediately reacted, raising his hand. "Everyone stay outside. No one enters the village until we've checked it out," he said, then turned to Richard and Lance. "You two are coming with me." Richard and Lance nodded, and without wasting any time, the three of them headed toward the village. As they approached, they noticed that the village appeared quite ordinary. People were walking the streets, going about their business. Some were mending nets, others chopping wood. But there was something intangible, something that didn't sit right. A tension hung in the air. The houses in the village were modest but sturdy, built from local stone and wood. The streets were clean, and at first glance nothing indicated danger. But Enzio kept growling, and even Lance, usually unflappable, started to look around more cautiously, his green eyes searching for the source of the threat. "Something's wrong here," Richard whispered, glancing around. "But I can't figure out what." They walked slowly down the street, feeling the thick smell of fish, mixed with salt and something rotten, invading their nostrils. The odor was so strong that they could almost taste it, like an unpleasant aftertaste they were eager to rid themselves of. In front of one of the houses stood a man behind a wooden stall. Laid out before him were vegetables, but they all looked as if they had been left out in the sun for weeks, shriveled, wilted, with mold creeping along the edges. Yet the man smiled, wide and unnatural, like a puppet whose mask had been forcibly pulled over his face. Lance approached him and asked why the vegetables were so spoiled, but the vendor merely nodded silently, maintaining his unnatural smile. The scene was so eerie that Lance instinctively took a step back. Before they could ask another question, a little girl around 10 years old suddenly appeared behind them, with ash-gray hair and blue eyes that seemed infinitely deep, like the abyss of the sea. She wore a white dress that evoked simpler times when life was calm and serene. Barefoot, she lightly stepped on the stones, tugging at Lance's cloak to get his attention. All three of them turned to the girl. Her melodic voice sounded oddly out of place, as if she didn't belong here, as if her presence was from another brighter world. "Are you travelers? Where have you come from?" she asked, looking at them with her piercing eyes. There was something unusual in her gaze, something foreign and incomprehensible. Balthazar, who had been silent all this time, quietly answered, "We've come from far away. Are you from here? Is everything okay? Aren't there any monsters attacking you?" The girl nodded energetically, her curls bouncing with the motion. "No, what monsters? We live well and happily here. Look at the people, how they smile. It's so nice here, maybe you'll stay too. You still have others, why don't they come here as well?" The monk acted strangely, saying nothing in reply. He simply turned and continued walking, cautiously glancing around. Richard and Lance followed him, with each step feeling that something wasn't right. The girl looked at them with a hint of offense when they ignored her invitation, but she didn't fall behind and kept asking questions, as if trying to penetrate their minds with her naive but insistent words. They walked past people engaged in their daily activities. Some women were washing clothes in large tubs, men were mending nets, and children were playing street games. But something in their movements seemed unnatural, as if they were all under some kind of spell. Balthazar stopped by one of the houses and tapped the wall with his cane, then ran his hand over the stone as if checking its structure. His movements were calm, but there was a tension in each gesture, as if he was searching for confirmation of his worst fears. The girl watched him with interest, furrowing her small brows. "Grandpa, you seem blind, but it feels like you can see. How do you manage that?" she asked, tilting her head innocently. But Balthazar, lost in his thoughts, didn't answer, only continued to walk forward. Finally, they reached the central square of the village. In the middle of the square stood a large bonfire, around which people were gathering bundles of wood, decorating it with various ribbons and symbols that Richard couldn't make out. The bonfire emitted an unpleasant smell, reminiscent of burnt fish. Richard looked at the girl and asked, "What's going on here?" "Today is a holiday," she replied cheerfully, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. "We're going to offer a sacrifice to our god." Balthazar paused for a moment upon hearing her words, but then, saying nothing, continued walking. Soon, they reached the other end of the village and headed toward the river, which could be seen in the distance. The river was wide and slow, its dark waters steadily flowing towards the sea. Along the banks stood wooden piers, lined up as if waiting for something or someone. Balthazar carefully inspected the shore and the piers, tapping his cane as if testing how sturdy these old structures were. The air was heavy with the smell of water and dampness mixed with the sea breeze. The water seemed calm, but its dark color and the reflection of the clouds created a menacing atmosphere. Richard looked at the monk, expecting some instructions, but the old man just shook his head and turned back toward the village. They walked through it and returned to their own. Surprisingly, the girl did not follow them, staying within the boundaries of the settlement. When they returned, Agna looked at Balthazar with concern and asked, "So what did you find?" The monk furrowed his brow, rubbed his bald head and replied, "There's definitely something wrong with that village. It could be some sort of spell or something similar. For now, you and Jenner stay here and guard the people. We'll go back there tonight to figure out what's going on. In the meantime, rest." Richard nodded and decided to grab a bite to eat, glancing around. The people from their caravan had come to rely entirely on them as their protectors. They sat in a circle, talking, laughing, and going about simple household tasks. Some were cooking food, others were tending to fires, and children were running around playing with Enzio. It all seemed like an ordinary, peaceful scene. But Richard couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Time dragged on slowly, and as evening fell, thick banks of fog began to envelop the surroundings. The monk, Richard, and Lance gathered once more and headed back to the village, with Enzio accompanying them, running around and sniffing at everything. The fog grew denser, swallowing light and sound, forcing them to move cautiously, as if through a thick smoke. When they entered the village, it looked even more sinister. Not a soul was in sight, as if all the villagers had hidden in their homes or vanished into the fog. An eerie silence pervaded, broken only by the sound of their footsteps on the cobblestone streets. Their path led them to the central square where they had seen people going about their daily business earlier in the day. Now, however, the center of the village was shrouded in a haunting atmosphere. In the middle of the square stood a massive pile of branches arranged for a bonfire. Nearby, several totems were erected, crudely carved from wood and covered with strange symbols. But the most terrifying sight was the enormous totem in the center, a monstrous figure resembling an octopus with many tentacles, which seemed to writhe even in its wooden form. The villagers had already gathered around the bonfire, standing in complete silence as if waiting for something. Then, as if on cue, they began to emit a strange sound, a cross between a hum and a moan. The sound grew louder, creating a rhythmic, hypnotic noise that made them want to cover their ears. The villagers did this in unison, like a single entity, as if they were bound by invisible threads. Soon, the same girl they had seen earlier in the day appeared in the square. Now her eyes seemed even deeper and more bottomless. She carried a bowl filled with something red. She walked slowly, almost ceremoniously, and placed it before the statue of the tentacled monster. Then someone from the crowd handed her a torch. The girl took it, raised her head to the sky, and screamed something in an ancient, unintelligible language. This cry echoed across the square like a summons, and the fire engulfed the pile of branches, shooting up with frightening speed. The flames erupted into a towering pillar of fire, illuminating the square with a bright light. The villagers' humming turned into a deafening roar, and at that moment, the girl began to twitch strangely, her body moving like a puppet on strings. She started chanting something ominous, repeating the same words over and over, then suddenly broke into a wild, ritualistic dance around the bonfire. Her movements were jerky, broken as if her body was no longer under her control. She leaped and twirled, her eyes shining with a strange light, reflecting madness, and at some point, it seemed that she was no longer a girl. But something ancient and terrifying awakened in her body. The trio stood nearby, watching this scene, and each of them felt a cold terror gripping their hearts. They knew they had to do something, but at that moment all their thoughts were consumed by the terrifying ritual unfolding before them. Suddenly, Richard felt a light nudge in his side, and turning, saw that it was Enzio. The dog looked alarmed, his fur bristling, and he tried to get Richard's attention, barking and tugging at his cloak. This wasn't normal behavior, and Richard realized that Enzio was trying to tell him something. The others noticed it too. Balthazar, seeing the dog's strange behavior, frowned and quietly said, "Let's follow him." Without asking questions, they left the ritual behind and followed Enzio. The dog moved confidently, occasionally sniffing the air and the ground as if picking up a trail. They followed him, glancing back now and then, as if expecting someone or something to emerge from the fog and chase after them. The path was winding, and soon they found themselves at the edge of the village, where a dilapidated wooden fence stood. The ground here looked disturbed, and the air was thick with the stench of decay and rot, making it hard to breathe. Enzio barked, urging them to hurry, and began digging at the ground near the fence, his claws furiously tearing into the soft earth. Richard quickly understood what the dog wanted, and tossing aside his sword, joined in, helping to dig. Lance and Balthazar stood nearby, warily scanning the surroundings. Finally, when they had dug deep enough, the remains of human bodies emerged in the pit. They had been dead for a long time. Their bodies had decomposed, and hardly any skin was left. The features of their faces were twisted in the agony of death, and the clothing that remained was simple, like that of peasants and fishermen. Richard felt his stomach turn with horror, but he didn't avert his gaze. These people had once lived here, worked this land, loved, and feared, just like him. Now they lay here in the dirt, forgotten by all. Balthazar looked at the unearthed bodies and slowly shook his head. "So that's it. They killed everyone in the village. Too bad we were too late," he said with sorrow in his voice, then folded his hands and quietly offered a prayer to the goddess, his words full of grief and respect for the dead. When the prayer ended, they decided to return to the square, where the strange dance continued. The fog still shrouded the village, giving it a ghostly appearance. In the square, they saw the villagers again, continuing their ritual. The bonfire's flames blazed even brighter, casting long, distorted shadows on the ground. The people still moved in unison, their motions mechanical and devoid of any life. Balthazar furrowed his brow even deeper and said, "Look at their shadows." Richard and Lance looked more closely, and what they saw made their blood run cold. The shadows cast by the fire were not human. They had no hands, no feet, no heads. Instead, the shadows resembled monstrous sea creatures with limbs like tentacles, flippers, or fins. Some of the shadows looked like giant fish with grotesque, writhing bodies, as if they had been spawned from the darkest depths of the ocean. But the most frightening was the shadow of the girl. It bore no resemblance to a human. Instead of the innocent shape of a child, her shadow had taken the form of an ugly snake or eel, as if it had emerged from the depths of nightmares. It seemed as though the shadow hissed and hummed while its owner performed her terrifying dance before the blazing bonfire. The square seemed filled with invisible beings, demons from the depths of the sea, hungry for blood and fear. The shadows were cast on the houses and the ground, momentarily becoming real, embodied in this world. Richard felt his hands tighten around the hilt of his sword. He understood that this place was a trap, created for those unable to see the truth behind the deceptive facade. Balthazar stood, frowning as he gazed at the strange spectacle unfolding in the square. His eyes were half closed, and his brow was furrowed, as if he was trying to recall something. Richard, noticing his deep thought, stepped forward and asked, "What are they doing? Should we stop them?" The monk seemed to hesitate for a moment, But then a flash of understanding crossed his eyes, and he suddenly lifted his head. "Yes, we must stop them," Balthazar shouted. "I thought this was just a harmless ritual, but it's not." Without a moment's delay, the monk gathered the energy of the moon, and his staff began to glow with a cold, silver light. He aimed it at the bonfire, which was blazing brightly in the center of the square. A beam of light shot from his staff, slicing through the air like lightning, and struck the bonfire directly. The fire exploded, scattering logs and sparks in all directions, showering everything around. But instead of stopping, the ritual seemed to reach its climax. The girl, who had been dancing around the bonfire, suddenly froze. Her body began to tremble violently, as if she was being pierced by some invisible energy. Then she slowly raised her head, and her mouth stretched into an unnaturally wide smile that quickly morphed into a horrifying scream. The sound was so loud and piercing that Richard, Lance, and Balthazar instantly fell to their knees, clutching their ears to try and block out the hellish shriek. The ground beneath them seemed to shake with the force of the scream. The trio lay on the ground, trembling in pain, their consciousness barely holding on, when the scream abruptly stopped. Richard struggled to lift his head and saw that the people in the square had begun to change. Their human forms started to warp and distort, as if their bodies were suddenly subjected to the power of some ancient curse. The villagers' skin began to swell, melt, and transform into scales, their faces elongated, turning into the grotesque snouts of sea monsters. Arms and legs morphed into flippers and claws. Some sprouted tentacles, while others grew long, thin, serpent-like bodies, covered in slime that emitted a suffocating stench of the sea and decay. The eyes of these creatures burned with a fierce fire of hatred as they all turned toward the trio, ready to attack. It was as if the illusion that hid their true forms had fallen away. Richard, fighting through the pain and numbness, forced himself to his feet. He drew his sword, which immediately began to glow with the light of the moon, and charged into battle. His strikes were swift and powerful, his sword cutting through the creatures, tearing their scaly flesh. But despite his efforts, the monsters continued to attack. Every movement they made was deadly, and they tried to surround the knight, raining down blows with claws and tentacles. Richard, however, remained calm. His sword literally glowed with fury, and with each strike he cleaved through the beasts, though it was no easy task. Lance, standing nearby, wasted no time. Out of nowhere he conjured a massive spear made of dark, dense energy and hurled himself into the fray. His movements were precise and lethal, each twirl of his spear ripping the monsters apart. He fought with confidence, as if he had long been preparing for such a battle. Lance parried the enemy's strikes and countered with devastating blows, tearing through their scales and sending them back to the hellish depths from which they had emerged. Meanwhile, Balthazar, maintaining his composure, also joined the fight. He continued chanting spells, his staff gleaming as it unleashed beams of lunar light in all directions. Each beam pierced the bodies of the monsters, turning them to ash. Despite his old age, Balthazar moved with unexpected agility, and his spells were incredibly powerful. He bombarded the enemies with lunar projectiles, tearing them apart with precise, deadly blows. The monsters seemed endless, but the trio skillfully and swiftly reduced their numbers. When Richard finally dealt with the last creature, he took a deep breath and turned to face the one remaining enemy, the girl who had now revealed her true form. She was no longer an innocent child. Before them stood a being with a female body, but instead of legs, she had a long, scaly serpent's tail. Her head had taken on reptilian features. Her eyes gleamed with a cold light, and where her mouth should have been, there were sharp, razor-like fangs. The creature lunged into the air with a terrifying hiss, striking at the trio with the speed and ferocity of a cobra delivering a lethal blow. Richard barely managed to raise his sword in time to deflect the attack. The impact was so powerful that it knocked him backward, and he barely kept his footing. He could feel the immense strength of this creature. The serpent tried to attack again, but this time her movements were accompanied by a sinister screech, so piercing that it seemed to tear through the very air. The sound invaded their minds, causing excruciating pain, weakening their will and clouding their thoughts. Richard felt his vision begin to blur, and he struggled to keep his grip on the sword. He saw Lance clutching his head, clearly suffering from the scream, and Balthazar staggering, his magic growing unstable. But the worst was yet to come. The space around them began to distort, as if time and reality themselves were bending to the creature's will. Illusions sprang up around them, and Richard saw dozens of copies of the creature emerge from the shadows, surrounding them on all sides, hissing and swaying menacingly. Each time he tried to strike one, the illusion would dissipate into the air, only for a new one to appear. The situation seemed hopeless. Lance struggled to stay on his feet, his spear poised for a strike, but he couldn't determine which enemy was real. Balthazar tried to cast a spell, but the creature's scream disrupted his concentration and his magic dissipated before he could complete the ritual. Gritting his teeth, Richard realized that they needed to act quickly, or they would all perish here. He gathered all his willpower, focusing on the reality around him. He knew that somewhere among these illusions, the true creature was hiding, and it had to be found. He closed his eyes, blocking out the external noise and focusing on his inner strength. Slowly, with each breath, he began to calm himself, and then he opened his eyes, locking his gaze on the serpent-like creature. He felt the red energy, the same power of the wolf that slumbered within him, begin to surge. And with this newfound strength, he suddenly saw through the illusions. There, among all the copies, he spotted the true body of the creature. Without hesitation, Richard charged forward. His sword blazed with a bright red light, as if it had been infused with blood. He carved his way through the illusions, shattering them with one blow after another until he reached the true creature. The serpent tried to defend itself once again, letting out a piercing scream, but this time Richard was prepared. He made a sharp lunge and, gathering all his strength, delivered a powerful strike to the creature's body. His sword plunged into the serpent's flesh, piercing it completely. The serpent howled in agony. Its illusions vanished, leaving only the true body, from which dark, thick blood began to pour. The creature writhed, trying to shake off the sword, but Richard twisted the blade with force, finally finishing it off. The creature's body convulsed in agony, its eyes dimmed, and it collapsed to the ground, dead. Its serpentine tail twitched convulsively for a moment longer before finally going limp. Richard stood over the body of the defeated monster, his chest still heaving from the battle. He studied the creature's remains and asked, "What kind of creature is this?" His gaze was cold, but deep down, he felt a flicker of fear. Balthazar, stepping closer, shook his head and quietly said, "The sea is vast and mysterious. Its depths may harbor creatures we know nothing about. Perhaps these are the descendants of those who invaded our land 1,000 years ago." These words made Richard ponder even more. But there was no time for deep reflection. They turned and noticed that the fog enveloping the village had begun to slowly dissipate. Night had already taken hold, and the moon, shining brightly in the cloudless sky, illuminated everything around with a silvery light. It seemed as though its cold glow was trying to pierce even through the remnants of the fog, giving everything an eerie appearance. But this brief moment of peace was deceptively soothing. Suddenly the ground beneath their feet began to tremble. At first lightly, but with each passing second, the vibrations grew stronger. A loud rumble filled the air, intensifying with each moment. The sound was familiar to them. They had experienced something similar when the giant shark emerged from the sea's depths. Back then, they thought it was the source of these sounds. But apparently, it was not. Balthazar abruptly turned to Richard and Lance. His face was tense, and his voice carried a sense of urgency. "Run! Get the people and lead them to the ferries. We must hurry. Something dangerous is approaching." Richard and Lance didn't waste any time asking questions. They turned and raced back to the refugee camp. Richard, skidding on the damp ground, was the first to reach the camp. The people, seeing the alarmed expression on his face, began to panic, but he quickly composed himself and, raising his sword, shouted, "Quickly! Gather your things! We need to leave here immediately!" Soon the refugees were on the move. The elderly, children, and women, everyone hurriedly packed their belongings, slinging bags over their shoulders and trying not to fall behind the flow of people rushing toward the river. They crossed through the village, leaving behind the site of the recent battle. Many of the people saw the remains of the monsters and, trembling with fear, hastened forward. The rumble in the air grew louder and the ground shook more violently. Richard and Lance led the way, constantly looking over their shoulders to ensure no one was left behind. Finally, the riverbank came into view. The wide, full-flowing river glistened in the moonlight, its waters appearing calm and peaceful compared to the horror they had left behind. Ferries were already waiting on the shore, rocking on the waves, ready to take all the refugees on board. Richard immediately began organizing the boarding. He and Lance helped the elderly and children, directing people to the ferries, trying to fill every available space as quickly as possible. The wooden ferries creaked under the weight of the people, but fortunately, they held up. The faces of the refugees were pale, but there was a glimmer of hope in their eyes. Richard took his seat on the first ferry, positioning himself near the bow so he could watch as the others boarded. His expression was focused, but deep down, a lingering anxiety remained. They were far from safe. The rumble and the trembling of the earth had not ceased, and something in the air told him that the danger was not over. Balthazar, watching as the last ferry left the shore, sighed heavily. He stood at the edge of the deck, his bald head slightly bowed, and his staff tightly gripped in his hand. The conversations and exclamations behind him went unnoticed. His thoughts were consumed by a sense of foreboding. Finally, all the ferries began to move away from the shore, slowly gliding over the dark waters of the river. As they sailed, each traveler felt the waves rising higher and higher, as if a giant hand was mercilessly rocking the ferries. The vibrations coming from the sea were transmitted through the water, causing hearts to pound in their chests. The river, wide and usually calm, now seemed agitated, as if nature itself was resisting the approach of whatever was coming from the sea. The opposite shore was already in sight, its dark silhouettes looming ahead, promising safety. But suddenly the river's current changed, as if the river itself had decided to alter its course. The water, as if obeying the will of an invisible colossus, began to flow back toward the sea, dragging the ferries with increasing speed. The people on the ferries started to murmur. Some prayed, while others silently stared at the approaching shore, hoping for a miracle. Richard stood at the bow of the ferry, his hand gripping the railing tightly. His gaze was fixed on the sea, He felt that these changes were no coincidence, that somewhere in the depths something terrible was lurking. Suddenly, the waves intensified sharply, as if pushed by a giant force. The ferries, which had been moving slowly just moments before, now sped toward the shore with incredible velocity. As soon as they reached land, a massive wave, with the power of a giant, slammed them onto the shore. The wooden decks creaked, but fortunately, they withstood the impact. The people, stunned and terrified, scrambled onto the land, glancing back at the sea with horror in their eyes. But Richard didn't move away from the railing. His eyes were locked on the sea, from which dark tentacles began to rise, writhing in the air. They were enormous, like pillars topped with giant suckers, and they looked as if they could crush any ship with a single blow. Behind the tentacles, a head appeared, resembling a monstrous face of a demon, its eyes glowing like two fiery orbs in the night. It roared, and the roar was like thunder, spraying waves and mist that fell on the land like rain. The creature was colossal, so large that its body didn't fully rise above the water. It looked like a nightmarish demon, a gargantuan figure crowned with tentacles that writhed in the air like thousands of snakes. Its head was covered in scales, sharp as blades, and it stared at the shore with indescribable fury, like a vengeful deity intent on destroying everything in its path. The people on the shore froze, paralyzed with fear. It seemed as though time had stopped. No one moved, no one spoke a word. They stared at the approaching creature, realizing their helplessness. Their hearts sank with the realization of the impending doom that drew closer with each passing second. Some fell to their knees, covering their faces with their hands, while others simply stared at the approaching monster with cold, fatal resignation. The moon, shining above them, seemed to only heighten the terror, its light cold and indifferent, a witness to the inevitable. This creature, emerging from the depths of the sea, was like death itself, embodied in a gigantic, monstrous form. It spread its tentacles, ready to destroy everything in its path, and nothing seemed capable of stopping it. In that moment, it felt as though the end had come, that their fate had been sealed by this ancient, merciless force. Suddenly, Balthazar stepped forward decisively, handing his faithful donkey to a man standing nearby. He turned to Richard and the others, shouting, "Run, don't look back! I'll try to hold it off!" Richard, standing close by, looked at the monk. Then, gathering his thoughts, also shouted, "Run! What are you waiting for?" The people, as if on cue, scattered, fleeing from the looming threat of the approaching monster. Richard wanted to follow Balthazar, but the monk turned to him and firmly said, "Stay, I can handle this." There was such confidence in the blind monk's voice that Richard didn't dare disobey. Agna, Lance, and Jenner joined him, all of them watching Balthazar with disbelief and astonishment. Jenner whispered, "Is that old man really going to fight that beast?" But Richard said nothing, continuing to observe. The monk slowly removed his hat and carefully placed it on the ground, then raised his staff and ran his hand over it. Before everyone's eyes, the staff began to change, and soon, instead of a staff, Balthazar held a long, broad sword that glowed with lunar light. The moonlight, as if gathering from all around, converged on the sword, enveloping the entire area in an ethereal glow. The monk began to gather speed, drawing the lunar energy around him as if all the moon's light was concentrated in his sword. It seemed as though the light itself enveloped his figure, making him part of this mystical force. The creature, noticing the monk approaching, roared and directed several of its tentacles toward him, preparing to strike. Balthazar, however, did not stop. Suddenly, as if an invisible staircase appeared before him, he began to ascend into the air with bright flashes of light flaring beneath his feet, propelling him forward with each step. The sword in his hands glowed even brighter, filled with lunar energy, and at the critical moment he swung it toward the monster. A bright and blinding light spread across the area, filling everything around them. A sudden flash illuminated the night sky, and the creature roared in fury. Blood and water splashed in all directions, staining the sea with crimson hues. The enormous creature was split in two, its parts slowly sinking into the ocean depths, leaving behind red streaks. Richard and his companions watched in stunned silence, their mouths agape, overwhelmed by the power Balthazar had just displayed. Jenner, still unable to believe what he had seen, asked, "I always knew the monk was strong, but to do that, has he been hiding this all along?" The creature, now split in two, slowly sank into the sea, leaving only waves and blood spreading across the water. Balthazar, struggling to maintain his balance, landed on the grass, then slowly picked up his hat and put it back on. It was clear that he was utterly exhausted. Richard hurried to him, supporting the old man and helping him walk. "You were incredible, old man," he said with admiration. Agna, Lance, and Jenner ran up to them, showering Balthazar with praise and astonished looks. But the monk, smiling wearily, merely nodded in response. Supporting the weakened monk, they finally caught up with the refugees who were hastily leaving the shore, looking back in fear and confusion. Seeing the return of their protectors, the people felt relieved and quickly gathered into groups, preparing to continue their journey. The realization that the monk had defeated such a monstrous creature instilled hope and confidence in them. The night was deep, with only the light of the moon guiding their way. The group gathered themselves, and ensuring that everyone was safe and unharmed, resumed their journey along the river. Ahead lay the goal of their travels, the city of Amelia, and each step brought them closer to it. Fatigue and anxiety gradually gave way to the feeling that the end of their journey was near.